Hey everybody, this is Tao at the Forge, and finally, I've had a few moments where I can do the Howling Mine recap that I've been trying to do forever. So let's go through it. So I would just want to say I'm going to go through the deck a little bit here. And nothing has really changed that much, except I put like the three Blood Moons main deck. I think it originally only had two, and other than that, it's almost all the same. The only real difference is I added Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, into the sideboard, and I took away one of the Temple Bells. I believe it's originally playing four, and now it's playing three, and I swapped it for Blood Moon, just because Blood Moon is so oppressive against opponents that are playing dual or non-basic lands that it's worth it to try and main deck it. And yeah, sometimes it's a dead draw, but it's okay. So I first want to start off by saying Howling Mine is a super fun deck to play, and by fun I mean your opponent is not going to have any fun. Like, it's just the kind of deck where, when you're winning, your opponents just can't do anything, and like they're just going to sit there and get upset. All right, so I mean, if you like that kind of deck, then that's the way to go. But if you're looking for more of a it's like a casual thing where people around the table are going to have fun, then this is probably not the right deck to play. Right? It's also probably would not be good in multiplayer, but probably would be. It's just very strong sometimes in one-on-one. So, anyways, just be aware of that if you're the kind of person who likes to play when your opponent's not having any fun, then this is the deck for you, or it could be. Right? So, as far as matchups go, I found that Owling Mine is either very strong or very weak, and it just depends. Like, I probably won more than I lost, but I think that's kind of meta dependent, because it just depends on whether or not your opponent has anything that can beat you. So for instance, like if you're playing against things like Burn or the White Weenies deck with Thalia, then you're just probably going to get wrecked. Right, and it's not pretty. You just get wrecked like super fast. Bouncing lands and stuff like that, like with Boomerang or Eye to Nowhere or Eye of Nowhere, that doesn't do anything against Burn because they only need like one mana to cast all their spells anyways. So and they're all playing basic mountains, so your Blood Moon doesn't do anything. Yeah, it's just awful. You're pretty much screwed. And they can beat you by turn 4 or turn 5. So even if you have your Witchbane Orb, that doesn't mean anything. Like you're already dead by the time you can get it out. So yeah, that's the matchup, how the matchups go. The thing is that it really works well against is works well against us like things like Stompy, where you have like just huge creatures. Anything that takes that where opponent has like a steeper curve where they're not getting stuff out until like turn 3 or 4, like Eldrazi or something like that. Those ones are those ones are pretty good matchups. You don't really care so much about things like Thought-Knot Seer because Thought-Knot Seer can take cards from your hand, but it doesn't really matter because you're just drawing so many cards. It doesn't really make any difference. Right. The reason why I added a Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, into the sideboard is because of Mill. Mill just crushes you otherwise. Because again, Mill's the kind of thing where it can basically. It doesn't need a lot of lands. It needs just gas, right? So there's only so long that you can stall out with your Boomerang and your Eye of Nowhere and Remand and stuff like that. But eventually they're going to get their 2 or 3 lands out that they need, and then you just have no defenses against it. So once they have that, they can just start putting stuff into your graveyard, and then they can surgically extract stuff away. And yeah, I found that those matchups just don't go well. So sorry, I put a Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. It makes it a lot stronger after sideboarding because my choice for Kozilek was just because he's the cheapest Eldrazi with that ability. Right, so for those of you that don't know, the ability is when Kozilek is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library. So, yeah, there's ways to get rid of it for Mill, but it's difficult, and usually by that time, then we can stabilize our board, and we're doing damage with Fevered Visions or Ebony Owl or something like that. So putting Kozilek into your deck just makes it a lot more competitive. I've never had a chance to hardcast it, but I guess you could possibly, and if you hardcast it, then I guess then you're probably just going to win. But anyways, that's the reason why I put it in is just because it's the cheapest one that does that. Like I could have put an Emrakul or what's the other one, Ulamog, but those ones are more expensive, and really I don't need them as actual creatures. I just need them like for their graveyard ability. I want to say that the deck is a little pricey for what it is. Right, so like if you look at some of the pieces here, like and I'm talking about in paper here. So looking at Steam events is probably right now about $10 each, right? Flooded Strand probably about, I don't know, 30 or something like that. Let's just say even 20, right? So you've got 20, 40, 60, 80, 120. The Blood Moons are probably worth about $20 right now as well, so it's $60 more. Ebony Owls are, depending, like $2 to $5. Time Warps are $25 each, right? So this deck is, in paper, is probably over $200, although you could make a budget version of it. But really, like, my opinion is that if you're going to be spending over $200 in paper, to like, unless you've just got like tons of money burning holes in your pockets, then this is probably not the most competitive deck that you could make. Like, for instance, if you go and if you have, let's say you had about $200 you wanted to spend, you could pretty much put together like a Soul Sisters deck or a Norn Sisters deck, and that deck, or Mono Blue Illusions for sure, could be put together for that kind of price. Those decks are, I find, like way more competitive and also way more fun overall to play, especially with friends. Like, people around the table aren't going to groan when you pull out your Soul Sisters deck or whatever. You could also play like black white tokens for around that much money. So like these are like tier 2 or 3 competitive decks, but Howling Mine is there too, right? So I wouldn't recommend it, like, unless you just happen to have a lot of these pieces, right? So I just happen to have, like, I actually have this in paper, but that's because I just happen to have, like, 4 Steam Vents and 4 Flooded Strands and 4 Blood Moons and stuff that I wasn't using. So I had most of the pieces anyways, and then, I just picked up an extra Time Warp and stuff like that. So I was able to put it together fairly cheaply for me. But overall, like, I wouldn't recommend people really putting it together in paper unless you had all the pieces, or you just like this style of play, right? Where you're just confounding your opponent. All right, so for strategy, you want to try turn 1 mine if possible, and you do that by getting a land out and then exiling Simian Spirit Guide and then getting your Howling Mine out. You basically want that as fast as possible because you want to start time walking your opponent with Eye of Nowhere and Boomerang, and basically it's better if you can keep drawing cards off of that, even if you have to discard them. So you can go like turn 1 island, exile Simian Spirit Guide, get down Howling Mine, then turn 2 get another island, Eye of Nowhere, bounce your opponent's land. Turn 3, repeat until you have no more Eye of Nowhere, then hold up either Remand or Exhaustion. And basically, by that time, then you'll have so many lands and your opponent will have nothing that you can put down your Ebony Owls, and basically they just can't do anything. And, they just get eaten by Ebony Owls. All right, so anyways, that's the ideal play. Right, that doesn't happen all the time or very often. Other than that, you just pretty much try and confound your opponent as much as possible. Be ready to play at about 1 life, like a lot. A lot of matches go down to 1 life. Blood Moon, like I said, you might want to try and drop that as soon as possible, but sideboard it out if, of course, if it's not making any difference. And almost anything could be better than it if your opponent's playing all basics. Runeflare Trap is awesome, right? So Runeflare Trap, I have had so many wins from double Runeflare Trap, and just kind of pulled it out of nowhere, where I've had like 2 mines and a Fever Visions, or even 3 mines or something like that. Opponent draws like up to 10 cards, and then you Runeflare Trap, and then win the game. All right, so that is an amazing addition to the deck. You definitely can't get rid of it. I would almost never sideboard it out. Cards that I would sideboard out are Blood Moon if your opponent's playing basics, and then after that maybe a Time Warp or an Exhaustion or something like that. Overall, like, it just depends. Maybe Remands, depending on what your opponent's playing. Right. So, all right. It's one thing I want to say about Howling Mine is that it's the kind of deck that can only get better with time, right? So, like, this is my opinion, of course, but like what I mean by that is it's not super, super strong, but it's kind of in a way like the Artifact Storm deck, right? Where you have your Pure Steel Paladin. And basically these types of decks are just, they're so janky, I guess, in a way, or so weird that like they can't really get worse because they just are what they are. But you're waiting for cards like, as over time, the only thing that could happen is that cards that just make this better could come out. Right? So what I would do is just constantly keep your eye out for cards that could improve this deck. Right? So things that like could make you draw extra cards even faster, or a better counter, although it's hard to say you get a better counter than Remand, more boomerang effects or things like that. So there's ways that, like, I'm not sure like what exactly that would look like, but I think there could be like one day a card that just comes out that just puts this deck over the top. That's something that Wizards have to take care of, I think, because if this ever became like 10 or 15% of the meta, then people would probably lose their minds and quit playing Magic. So, I think that Wizards will be as they should be very careful about, making cards that could put this deck like into tier one strategy here. All right. The last thing I want to say is that if you play this deck, your opponents will not like it. And I've mentioned that a couple times already. Like, I've had so many salty players, and it's not just salty players, like, because I've had salty players in other matches as well, but like an unusually high amount of players that hate this deck a lot, right? They just have no fun playing it. Like, I play other annoying decks. Like, if you look in my sideboard here, or in my sideboard in deck list, I have like Lantern Control, Mill, Bogles, like Blue Fairies, and yeah, there are some. You do get salty players that get frustrated because those are all like control-y decks, or like just weird decks like that can stymie your opponent. But in this deck, like, you probably get around 25 to 35% of your opponents that either just scoop after game one, or they tell you to F off, or just like freak out. Like, they just get so enraged by this deck. I have an idea of why. And I think that, I'll just say what it is, I guess. The reason why is because when you play Lantern Control, the person knows what's happening. It's actually almost the same type of thing as Lantern Control, where your opponent is getting cards, but they just can't play them. Right? You're just stopping them from playing like at all. And they're playing Magic because they want to play Magic. Like Mill is frustrating to play against because you feel like your cards are leaving, but it's actually not really that difficult, not that bad of a strategy. Mainly because the cards that are in your library are cards that you never had anyways. Right? That's why 8-Rack is so much worse than Mill. Right? Because when you're taking away cards from a player's hand, right, that's really bad. But putting like 10 cards from the library or 5 cards from the library, in a turn isn't really awful, unless your opponent can just do it super fast, right? Because you're not playing that card anyways. You never had that card. But with Howling Mine, you have cards. Your opponent's giving you cards all the time. And for many people that haven't played this deck, I think one of the things is that they see like, oh, I get to draw these extra cards, and that's awesome because that's what you want. Usually in Magic, like, drawing extra cards is amazing. So people are like, okay, yeah, that's cool, and you get to see all these cool cards that you have. And then you play down you play down your Polluted Delta or whatever, and then your opponent bounces it back. Right? And then you're like, okay, well, haha. And then next turn, you play it back down, your opponent like bounces it back to your hand, or then you get it bounced back to your hand, and they're like, okay, seriously now, right? And then this happens like 3 or 4 more turns, and then finally your opponent, you're like, okay, opponent must be out of those now, and then the person drops a Blood Moon on you and puts you off your colors, right? Like, and then you're like, okay, well, seriously, now I can't even play at all, right? And then you're like, okay, well, do they even have a win condition, right? Like, people have even asked me that, like how are you even going to win like this, right? And then you put down your Ebony Owl or your Fevered Vision. It's like death of 1,000 cuts, right? Especially with Fevered Visions, like 2 at a time over 10 turns, it's just awful. And then you're just not letting your opponent play, So I mean, I think that's why, is because it's kind of like Lantern Control in a way where your opponent can see all these cards that they're getting, except in Lantern Control, like, they just don't get the card. But in Howling Mine, they actually get the card. They just can't play the card, because you're doing one thing or another to them all the time, right? So I've found, like, seriously, about 25 to 35% of opponents, like, just scoop or get really mad and just start swearing at you in the chat. More so than any other deck I've ever played, probably more than every other deck I've played combined. So, I'm not sure what it's like in your meta or your LGS. If you bring this to Friday Night Magic, people might find it amusing, but, I would say, be prepared for some table flipping, because people really hate this deck a lot. Right. Anyways, if you're the kind of person who likes to play it, then, go ahead and play it if you've got the money to kind of burn on this. I enjoyed playing it quite a bit, but, I'm kind of a sadist like this, and, that I really like, I think it's funny sometimes to play when your opponent can't play. But anyways, that's pretty much what I have to say about the deck. If you have any suggestions, put them in the comments. If you've tried this out, then let me know what you think. Anyways, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.